Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for NWHM Presents. My name is Emma, and I'm the Associate Educator of Digital Learning and Innovation at the National Women's History Museum, and I will be your host today. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. Our panelists will be answering questions at the end of the conversation primarily. You are welcome to ask your questions at any time during the program using the Q&A function on the toolbar. You may ask your questions at any time during the presentation, but again, primarily we're going to be answering them at the end of the program, and our panelists are incredibly happy to answer your questions. And with that, I would love to introduce our program today. Our virtual tour today is of department stores and focuses on their historical significance. Led by A Tour of Her Own, or TOHO, the first tourism company in Washington, D.C. to focus exclusively on women's history, we will discuss the ways a simple trip to the store was in fact so much more. TOHO specializes in historical tours, special events, consulting, and virtual experiences. And we are joined today by Caitlin, who's already joined us on the screen, and Megan from A Tour of Our Own, who will lead us through this exciting history. So we are really excited for this conversation. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Caitlin and Megan.
Hi, Emma. Thank you so much for that incredible introduction. I want to thank the National Women's History Museum for partnering with us today for this virtual tour. My name is Caitlin Caligiura. I'm the founder of A Tour of Her Own and the author of this book, 111 Places in Women's History That You Must Not Miss. And I'm so excited to introduce you to one of our team members, an amazing tour guide, Megan Hansen, and she'll be leading us on a journey today during this festive season to learn more about the history and culture of department stores. So while A Tour of Her Own is based in Washington, D.C., we welcome all of you from all across the world to enjoy this program. Megan, take us away.
All right, wonderful. Now, I did want to say just a couple things. So a little bit about my background. I specialize in anthropology, focusing on museum studies and art history. So I like to joke, basically, I'm a giant nerd that hates writing papers, which is how I became a tour guide. Of course, DC is great for museums, which is one of the things that brought me here. I had actually spent 10 years in Chicago, and that's actually where some of the roots of this particular program come from. I was in Chicago when a lot of the department store flagships were undergoing some transitions. Marshall Fields was being bought out by Macy's, and everybody was threatening to boycott if they got rid of the Marshall Fields name. The old Carson Fury Scott, which will be the only department store that I flash up here that is not in Washington, D.C., built by Louis Sullivan, everybody's trying to figure out what to do with it and things like that. And then when I moved to Washington, D.C., to see kind of some of that similar history, I found really, really fascinating. And so I, a lot of times, approach my tours from a little bit of a culture, a little bit of a large encompassing. There won't be as many like specific women's names to Google in this particular presentation, but I like to talk about some of the cultural aspects that led to changes in society, especially what I like to call accidental feminism. This idea that sometimes people can support feminist causes, not because they're feminists, just because it so happens that that's the way things are working for them. And department stores is a perfect example of that. So let's jump into the streets. And specifically, the gross, muddy streets of Washington, D.C. Now, I don't know how many of you have had a chance to visit our nation's capital, but the United States Capitol is damp. Very, very damp. Apparently the pH is wrong. It's not actually a swamp, but that's a science program, not a department store program. But there is a lot of water here. We are right on the confluence of two rivers, the Anacostia and the Potomac. And in fact, one of the major streets that goes through the famous section of Washington, D.C. was originally a canal. And basically Constitution Avenue is just built over that canal. So when the humidity decides to turn into rain, it floods. Now, DC is also a man's town. This is a kind of an odd city. In many ways, it has more similarities to Versailles than it does to Paris. It was basically this small, tiny little place that didn't really have much going on, other than, when they decided to put the government here. And so if you wanted to go to the government, you weren't going to New York or Philadelphia, these big cosmopolitan places that already have money and power and influence. No, they're forcing even the guys with money, power, and influence to basically go to the middle of nowhere on the border between Virginia and Maryland to come talk to the government. So the actual locals, very, very small part of the population. And most of them work to support the people coming to visit and interacting with the government or the government itself. So in the early 1800s, even right through about the American Civil War, 1860s, if you want to get things, then you're going to go probably to like a corner store, drugstore. We've got this wonderful photo here. By the way, if you walk between these two buildings, this is the Treasury building, this is an old bank. Walk between these buildings, you're about a block away from the White House. This is the pedestrian entrance to go see the White House right now. And so you're going to go to a store like this. And on the inside, it'll look an awful lot like this. Everything's behind the counter. No browsing. You basically give this, I'm sure, very nice young man here, a list of everything you want. And then he goes around and he goes down the aisles over here and over here, picking out everything on your list, put it in a box, and then you take it away. And one of the reasons for that is that the person actually doing a lot of the shopping, if it wasn't servants, it was going to be gentlemen, because women did not go out in public. That if you went out in public unescorted, it would be assumed that you were for sale as a woman. And so this is something that the wife or the person in charge of the household would often, make up a list of what they need. Then the gentleman can drop this off and go ahead and, bring it home, or possibly even get it delivered, again, depending on your social station. So this is how shopping was for quite some time. And as far as, like Hollywood representations, I'd say mostly we see this in the Western movies, the spaghetti Westerns and such. But this is what it was even in the bigger cities and the smaller towns. So Washington, D.C., around this time is revisiting the layout of the city. And so while it's laid out by a Frenchman, his name is Pierre, although I prefer to go by Peter, and he was a military artist and engineer and a bit of an artistic personality. Pierre Laffont is a fascinating, fascinating character if you want an interesting new biography to pick up. But the plan needed some updates. And so they have what they call the Macmillan Plan. This is going to be the plan of Washington, D.C. that we're familiar with. This is going to be Capitol Hill over on your right, and this is going to be the White House up at the top. Down at the bottom is going to be near where the Jefferson Memorial is today. And then over here, we've got where the Lincoln Memorial is. So just to kind of give you an idea, this is pretty much where everybody is. This is it. Like, there's houses and stuff around here, but most of the action is going to be on these roads. This here, connecting the White House and the Capitol, is going to be Pennsylvania Avenue. So this is where we're starting. This is what we're working with. Around the time that all of a sudden the people running stores realize women have household budgets and they want that money. And so they have to figure out, how can we make it so that women can come and spend money in our establishments? And that is going to take a fairly radical shift in the way society approaches women. Now, a lot of the early stores don't necessarily start out quite as department stores. So this is actually going to be on Pennsylvania Avenue. You cannot find these buildings today. These basically sit on top of what is today one of the subway stations, the Archives, Navy Memorial Station, and of course, as the name implies, Navy Memorial. Big open space now. These buildings don't exist. However, this building does. It has a gold dome and has a Starbucks, so useful to know. Now, these are going to be some of these early department stores. Saks & Company is not Saks Fifth Avenue. There was several different Sachs along the East Coast. This is a fairly common family name, and several of them decided to go into retail. And then you have Cannes. And so these two are basically somewhat competitive. They both are selling clothes, they're both selling home goods, department stores, and these retail shops in particular. One of the reasons why they're able to expand is because of the factories of the Industrial Revolution, which of course kick off in earnest after the American Civil War. And so all of a sudden we're getting the factory-made clothes and factory-made cookwares and dishwares and pottery and things like that. And so Saks and Cannes decide to make an agreement. Saks is going to sell the stuff for the men, and Cannes can sell the stuff for the family. Now, Saks figures this is a pretty good deal for them. After all, the men are the ones with the money. However, about 10 years ago, maybe a touch longer, Forbes put out a really interesting article, which was also one of the things that was popping around in the back of my mind when I wanted to start this tour, which says that women control 80% of the purchasing power in the United States. So that's very different than earning power. Purchasing power, basically what it means is that 80% of money spent on purchases, one of the decision makers is going to be a woman. And it kind of makes sense. Like, even if you're getting, say, a house or a car and you're a single guy, you're probably still going to run it by like your mom or a significant other or someone else, just to kind of get like a second opinion. And a lot of times women will fill in that space if they're not the defining opinion. Again, buying for the kids, the house, the grandparents, all the extended family. Exactly, as you're seeing in the chat. Yeah, 80%. That almost seems a little low when you start thinking of it like that. So Cannes takes that, and I got to be honest, I've talked to a lot of native DC people doing this as a walking tour. Nobody remembers Saks and Company being there. They all remember Cannes having taken over. And in fact, Cannes becomes known as the busy corner. Now, the building that we saw next to Saks is this one here. You can see that circular window right there. And so for those of you that know DC, this is going to be going up 8th Street. And so this is one of these emporiums. You can see the busy corner. It's right on Pennsylvania Avenue. People are coming, people are going, and all sorts of things are going on. It's right about at 8th Street. It's right about halfway between the Capitol, because the Capitol is between the two First Streets, and White House is at 16th Street. So it's perfectly positioned there. Now, Cannes is a little interesting. They decided that the way they were going to make their money is by being the cheapest in the area. And so even if that means they have to start discounting things by a tenth of a penny, they are going to go about that. And so the only place we really see that today is going to be like gasoline. And I will say, like, even though I know what's going on, it definitely works on me. Like $2.99.9 still seems so much cheaper than $3 a gallon. It's literally a tenth of a cent. Like it's going to save me what, like a penny on 10 gallons, like it's nothing, but it's psychologically there and it totally works. Even today, even when a penny isn't worth nearly as much as what it was worth back then. Now, they also took a very unusual approach because even though that they were targeting women as their primary spenders, they did something a bit different than almost all the other department stores. So I'm going to pull up a painting of one of our first ladies. Her name is Frances Cleveland. Frances Cleveland is one of our lesser known first ladies, although in her day, she was Jackie Kennedy before Jackie Kennedy was born. And so she is 21 years old, stunningly gorgeous. This is actually painted while she is first lady, because she marries the sitting president, who's like 46 at the time, Grover Cleveland. She marries him in a White House wedding. She is the first, or he is the first president to actually get married in the White House during his presidency. All the ones that got married before that got married in the church. So she has this big, flashy White House wedding that's covered by all the press. And, she's very fashionable. She's very pretty. And so she is in all the papers. And in fact, her image is used and abused so much by advertisers. It's one of the reasons why we have laws about being able to use someone's image in advertising and how you have to have their permission. And you can't just, use whatever public figure you want and say they support this. Now, the story goes that Frances Cleveland is walking down Pennsylvania Avenue with her entourage. They're out browsing. They pop into cans. She sees a couple things that catches her eye, and she brings them up to the counter. Now, I have to remember, so her husband is going to be in the very kind of last decade of the 1800s, and he's going to be the only president that served 2 non-consecutive terms, but to still serve 2 terms as president. And so she's walking down Pennsylvania Avenue, and that this time money is very dirty. By the way, I don't know if you've heard this, but money is the root of all evil. And so in general, women were not really expected to have or handle money. You started a tab, you started an account with these stores. And so she goes up to the counter and she's like, all right, I'd like to start an account. Hands doesn't do accounts, cash only. And so I can't even imagine how terrifying it must have been to be that person behind the cashier that basically had to tell effectively Jackie Kennedy at like the height of her fame and fashionability, like, I'm so sorry, even though like we all totally know who you are, like, yeah, you can't run a tab, you have to have cash. The love of money is the root of all evil, although I'm not sure they parsed it quite that carefully back then. And so basically what it said is that she was actually very gracious about it. Between her and her entourage, they had enough to cover the bill, and so then they go their way. Now, I saw a couple of people noticing the other image, though, here. This was much more common. Is you get a little metal plate, and for those of you that have ever been somewhere where the credit cards weren't working, they had to do the carbon copies. That's basically what you're working with here. So this is Mrs. F.D. Roosevelt. That would be Eleanor. And so, by the way, if they listed her as Mrs. Eleanor Roosevelt, that would mean she was a divorcee, and that would be quite the scandal. So she had to go by her husband's initials. So, small changes here, small changes. But you would have basically a plate like this, and then the man in charge of the money was supposed to come by every couple of weeks, every month, whatever, and pay off the bill on a routine system. Now, so the more common department stores, not the ones that were kind of targeting some of that unusual exclusivity with like the lowest prices and such. So we're actually going to start with one that got taken over fairly early on. So it's a little bit short-lived, but it's a good way to ease ourselves into the more traditional department stores. So this is the Raleigh Hotel. It started out as the Palais Royal, which is going to be a very fancy department store. They said that they were one of the first to have a lounge down on the ground floor so that you could wait for your friends to come and join you. Of course, no cell phones back then, barely telephones back then. And so, you'd meet up with your friends, but you couldn't say, hey, the horse ran into a ditch or something, like I'm running late. So this is where you could wait for your friends, because after all, it's always more fun to go shopping with friends in a lovely, very plush, very cushy sort of place. As opposed to, remember those general stores? Yeah, there's nowhere to sit. You're just standing there waiting to be taken care of. Now, the Raleigh Hotel is right on Pennsylvania Avenue. This is a picture of Pennsylvania Avenue right after the rain. Look at that massive puddle. That's so gross. And these are dirt roads. DC it takes a little bit before we get the paved roads and the things. And something else worth knowing at this time is that it was not appropriate to show one's ankles in public, even when getting into or out of a carriage. So your dresses had to be long enough to cover your ankles while getting in and out of a carriage. And so those dresses are going to drag in this muck and this mud going in and out of these department stores. And the other thing is that the way that laundry works, you normally would have just a couple overdresses. You'd wash your chemise, your undergarments daily, but the overdresses a lot of times were just spot clean. So you're going to get your, see and be seen dress. You're going to get mud on that hem. I mean, is that mud even coming? And mud at the best. I mean, again, there is a lot of horses in this area too. And so what they were finding is that on rainy days, business drops. And on rainy days, they also have problems with flooding. The water table's pretty high here. So the Palais Royal is going to be the first to leave Pennsylvania Avenue. and they go north, and they go pretty far north. They go up to G Street. So those of you that, again, know DC, we're talking like up by the arena or where the Smithsonian National Portrait American Art Museum is. So we're number of blocks north of Pennsylvania Avenue at this point. And they build a brand new store. This is in the latest department store architecture of the time. Now, this is where we briefly sojourn out of Washington, D.C. Department store comes from actually Sullivan and Adler, who are going to be Chicago architects. Now, Louis Sullivan, who is going to be the mentor to Frank Lloyd Wright, one of the most famous architects of the early 1900s. But one of the things that Sullivan really instilled in Frank Lloyd Wright, and there were a few of them in Chicago, is that they felt that the United States had been a country long enough that we deserved our own style of architecture. They didn't want to keep doing all of these French revivals and Greek revivals and Roman revivals and, you know, this revival and that revival, which was what we were seeing a lot in New York. And so Sullivan is one of these vanguards, and he designs this department store. It wasn't originally Carson Peary Scott, but this was the longest tenant. And so after Carson Peary Scott closed, it actually stayed dormant for about 10 years until Target took it over. That was near the end of my time in Chicago. But I actually do love that it got to stay a department store because that's what it's designed for. He did these massive plate glass windows all along the bottom. And of course, that leads to this time of year, one of the most famous things, the holiday windows. And then you have floors and floors of retail. And then you've got offices up near the top. So this was actually the only Chicago style architecture building in Washington, D.C. Spoiler alert, it does not stand anymore. The McLaren Banking Corporation behind it is still there. And that was actually a compromise as they agreed to save the smaller building and tear down the larger one. So they move up north. And that's going to be kind of one of the first main buildings up there. But pretty soon after, you get the most famous department store in Washington, D.C., and that is going to be Woodward and Lothrop, affectionately known as Woody's. What Macy's is to New York, what Marshall Field's is to Chicago, what Wanamaker's is to Philadelphia. I saw a couple of you guys in the chat. Woodward and Lothrop was to Washington, D.C. Now, fashion icon Tim Gunn grew up here. And he used to say that Woodward and Lothrop was the Buick, to use a car analogy. So Buicks were family cars, but often a little bit of a little bit of a splurge. Like you might have to save up a little bit to get a Buick. Chevys were the ones everybody could afford. That was going to be your Hecht's department store, and the Cadillacs were Garfinkel's. We'll talk about those other two later. But Woody's is going to be the one that puts on the parades, that hosts the city celebrations. And they really do embrace this idea of a department store in the same way Macy's and Marshall Field's does. So not only do they have home goods and they have furniture and they've got clothing, they have a travel department. They have, photography studios. They have the visitor center basically for Washington, D.C. If you wanted to know how to get to the Washington Monument, or what hours the Lincoln Memorial was accessible, or how to get into Congress, you go to Woody's. To the visitor center was in the middle of this department store. Now, they ended up taking over the whole block, although they started in this one little section. Now, of course, these windows, again, they're bringing in this foot traffic. So let's kind of circle back to the women. Now, I mentioned how being out and about on the street by yourself for a long time, just not done. And honestly, in the lower classes, you tried to avoid it as well, if at all possible, because again, on the streets, you're for sale. But window shopping like this doesn't work unless women have time to stop and browse. And so there's a few different things that these department stores did to give women a reason to be in public. And so they created these massive sales displays in the windows that would help draw people in. I mentioned the lounges, this ability to sit and wait for your friends in comfort. Not just all these different departments, there's a lot to look at, but all the things are in front of the counter. You still have to go to the counter for purchasing, and maybe a few expensive things you're going to still see behind the counter. But in general, you can go there, you can spend a day, and even if you don't spend any money, they will not kick you out. It's all about that kind of Target philosophy, the old joke that you walk in with a list of 20 things to buy at Target, and you walk out with 50 things, only 10 of which were actually on your list. And they realize that taking advantage that women have time and money is going to get them higher sales. Now, there's another trick that they do. And so besides, because at the end of the day, it all does come down to sales. These may be pretty, but it's all about the things you can buy inside, even the Christmas ones. And so one of the things that they found is that you can teach soft skills. And when you got hired by a department store, you could go to classes and they would teach you all about like how to be a good listener, how to talk to people, and just a lot of these very like these social skills, because they wanted to be welcoming. They wanted to keep you there. The longer you're there, the more likely you are to find something that you absolutely cannot live without. Sale. Now, I will say pretty much all of the cashier's solutions to all of your problems in life is retail therapy. But imagine, you're the husband, and all of a sudden your wife is going to this place and there's this very handsome young man behind the counter, and oh no, he absolutely sides with her against Beatrice because Beatrice is just awful. And no, she has to have this dress to fight with Beatrice and, to show that she's much better, much more sophisticated than me. Yeah, sorry, I actually love the name Beatrice. It's my grandmother's name. But, so all of a sudden we have this handsome young man that understands and agrees with everything his wife is saying and listens to. No, this is not okay. So department stores start hiring women as well. And this becomes, in many ways, it has the same kind of social status as the flight attendants, the stewardesses of the golden age of flying. These are the young, the sophisticated, the beautiful single women out on town that everybody wants to be. And so they create what is, in many ways, kind of the first white collar job for women that you don't have to fight for a college education for, or for credentials, or to be let into the boys club. And so it creates, again, a space for women to be alone. They're going to work, they're going to shop, they're out in public now. And just look at all of these people surrounding Woodward and Lothrop, looking at those windows on this gorgeous summer day. And compare that to this, like here, I don't know, maybe it's just the modern girl in me, but like, I want to get my shoes out of this stuff as quick as possible. And now we're to here. Now, again, one of the other ways that they're doing this is that they are really trying to take up all of that free time that women have. This is a time when, at least as a upper class man, it is a status symbol that your wife does not work. And so I do another tour about women in the workforce before World War II. There are plenty of women working before World War II. But in general, it is a status symbol that your wife doesn't work and that she has a staff to take care of most of the cooking and cleaning, which means that she's got a lot of free time, and she probably is also being given a pretty juicy household budget. And so we have the formal room, we have the silver room, and then the tea room. If you were out on the streets, and this is actually a true story, this happened in New York, a mother and daughter were shopping and it starts to rain. They duck into a restaurant. The owner of the restaurant literally shoves them back out on the street into the pouring rain because he is not the sort of establishment where women dine alone. And so a lot of Marshall Fields likes to take credit that it was his wife's pot pies that kind of became the first meals that were served at department stores, but it quickly takes over this idea that there is a place for women to dine outside the house. They don't have to go back home and then decide, I really want to go back out and travel back, no, they can just stay there. And so this is one of the first places that women can be all day outside the house, because there's a place for them to sit. There's a place for them to use the restroom. There's a place for them to eat, find refreshment. This really becomes an event. Now, as I said, this is going to change things not just for the upper class. This is changing things for the lower class. So I've got a couple of these paintings by Elizabeth Sparhawk Jones, shout out to women artists. And so, and this one, you know, they're going through everything. I will say there is definitely some stratification. Your popular girls are going to be on the cashiers. They're going to be young. They're going to be pretty. They're going to have a lot of kind of, you know, very similar rules to how you look and how you are and how you act. And, you know, if you start losing your looks or if you get married, there's a very good chance you're going to be losing your job. Women that are not as conventionally attractive, they can still get jobs there. And in fact, again, the idea is that you want the women interacting with women. That makes their husbands sleep much sounder at night. And so if you are, you know, maybe more only, like I said, not as conventionally attractive, and that also includes if you are part of a minority group, then you might be put in stocking. You might be put in the stock room, working elevators, or possibly even in the factory. And so it's not necessarily that only the pretty young women can get the job, that there is very much a, you know, those are going to be the faces of the company. But this is actually a photo of the factory itself. And so we are seeing women in the factory, of course, that's starting to be more blue collar. But again, it creates this ability for women to support themselves in a way that wasn't as socially acceptable or was significantly more difficult, especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And so, and again, this is all capitalism. Again, they want women to be able to shop there, and they want husbands to feel comfortable that their wives are shopping there because otherwise he won't pay the bills. And all of this kind of spins out of this. But what we find is by the time periods that we're talking about in the chat, by the time periods of Mad Men and Mrs. Maisel, department stores factor into both of those shows, it's going to be like the 1960s. It wasn't unusual to see women on the sidewalks by themselves, you know, going out and about their business. There was an expectation that they had a reason, a right, and a purpose for being there. Now, you're standing on the site of the old Palais Royal. It was eventually bought out by Woody's. It was known as Woody's North. And eventually it does get torn down as the era of the flagship department stores starts to come to an end. Now, this is one of the best shots, though, I was able to get of the full Woodward and Lothrop facade. This is going to be the facade on the north side. And so it's incredibly beautiful to walk by. The facade has been restored. It is no longer a department store either. But one of the things that I like to stress as far as the power, especially Woodward and Lothrop, this section right here, that's a metro station. And so that metro station is known as Metro Center. It was not supposed to be there. It was supposed to be a couple blocks away. Woodward and Lothrop had such influence on the city council. They got them to move the metro station right underneath their building. And you had an entrance straight from the metro station. And so especially in the 1950s, as we start to see that spread out into the suburbs, and we start to see the satellite locations of these department stores pop up closer to where people live. In large cities, a lot of times, if there's a train into town, the women would drop their husbands onto the train to go to work, and then they would keep the car to do their shopping. And so we're starting to see, especially in the 50s, a little bit of a pull from the downtown stores. But Woody's figures out, hey, if we are one of the stops on the subway, they can literally, from from the parking lot, they get into the subway system, they come into our store, they spend all day, they go back on the subway. They don't have to be outside at all from the time they enter the metro system to the time they leave. This is massively powerful for Woody's and massively important for their bottom line. And again, it's being able to stay connected to where the women with the household budgets are at. Now let's talk about that Cadillac. So Garfinkel and Company. So love this shot because one of my favorite stories when it comes to Garfinkel's has to do with this ledge and this building back here. This building back here is the National Press Building. And so Garfinkel's an interesting dude for his time. We are jumping back to that late 1800s period. So kind of the heyday before we've got a lot of movement out to the suburbs, kind of near the beginning as department stores are really starting to become the thing. So Garfinkel's wants to open up as the place to be. He's got lots of ideas about that. He wants anything that he carries to be the exclusive purveyor in Washington, D.C. He would offer bonuses for his staff if they could find something that they sold at Woody's or at Hex or especially at Cannes. He would give them a bonus for finding that and like cut that contract because has an exclusivity contract in Washington, D.C. for everything he carries. Garfinkel's was about 2 blocks from the White House. And this here is what today is the Intercontinental Willard Hotel. Always one of the ritziest hotels in Washington, D.C. So he's really getting that very high-end clientele. This is where you go shopping for your inaugural ball gowns. This is where you go shopping for your debutante gowns. And this is where you go shopping for your wedding gowns and all the other things that go with all of that. Now, when he's building his building, he's just a little bit behind the National Press Building. This is important because D.C. likes its sunlight. You may have heard that buildings in D.C. are not allowed to be taller than the Capitol. That is not correct. The actual legislative language is that buildings are not allowed to be more than 20 feet taller than the widest street adjacent to it is wide, because D.C. didn't want those canyons that we associate with New York and Chicago and things like that. They wanted things to keep nice and sunny here. And so they brought in the building height requirements and they brought in setback requirements. Garfinkel being just a little bit behind, he misses the deadline. He has to do a setback in his building. It's kind of furious, but it works out okay. You see, this guy is also a teetotaling vegan. Some accounts say vegetarian, but some accounts say vegan. Back in the late 1800s, when there is a temperance movement, but it's not that big yet. And vegetarianism is not a big thing in this period, but he's that. And so he also is all into fresh air and all those other healthy things. And so he has his office set outside. Now, where the key comes in is they said you could always tell when the ladies were modeling the spring fashions because nothing would come out of the press office that day, the press building that day, because all the reporters were up on that top floor watching the ladies parade in Garfinkel's outdoor office. And so even the press men weren't completely immune to the charms of the department store. Now, Garfinkel, he is a little bit of a complicated person when it comes to DC history. And some of that is because he was a little reclusive. He would keep lists of a lot of the society ladies and what was coming up on their schedule and such, so that like when he went to Paris, if he saw something that he thought would be good for them, he would purchase it, so it'd be one of a kind. But this is also going to be civil rights era reconstruction into civil rights. And so DC is a segregated city. There were no African-American employees at Garfinkel's until the 1970s. And even after the 1970s, there are definitely stories of African-American clientele not being welcome to purchase. You were allowed in, but when you took your purchases up to the counter, you would be ignored in favor of pretty much anybody else or restocking to make it clear that your money was not good enough here. Now you contrast that with the fact that when he dies, he leaves all of a massive amount of his money, he doesn't have any kids, to the YWCA to support women in job training. And that the organization still has that segment that he helped found with his money as part of their organization in Washington, D.C. I also like to throw out there that he turned down all social invitations. He did not like parties. The one person that we know that he actually would hang out with was Calvin Coolidge, the president whose nickname is Silent Cal. They would go for horseback rides in Rock Creek Park, apparently companionable silence. And so Garfinkel's, like I said, it's kind of a complicated legacy in that respect. They are one of the last to bring in a restaurant. It was known as the Greenbrier. After his death, they became one of the first to serve alcohol. And so they are going to the first of the department stores to dining establishments to serve alcohol. And the ladies back then, they were drinking old fashions and Manhattans, and yeah, none of the blended proof. They were drinking a lot of whiskey drinks back then and gin drinks. So when he was in charge, he would staff his restaurant only with redheads wearing blue, the whole thing. And will say that I do love this picture of all of the employees being able to try out the different toys in the toy department. Now, today, Garfinkel's is a restaurant on the first floor called Hamilton's. You do get a little bit of that vibe. It's like mahogany and leather sort of vibe, and it does remind me a little bit of the Walnut Room at Marshall Pass. So you can get a little bit of that, but pretty much almost none of the stores that we're going to see still operate as a department store. And that brings us to Heck Company. Well, Heck Company is the Chevy. It's the one everybody can find a place at. It's the one with the clock. You have to have one department store in the city that has to have a clock. Meet me at the clock. And so this is going to be the original location. It's on 7th Street. And 7th Street was where 7th and 14th Street were where the first streetcars were. So again, being able to bring in staff and patrons. Garfinkel's is on 14th Street. Heck Company is on 7th Street. Woodward and Lothrop and the Palais Royal are a little bit between them. Now, the Hecht Company, they were paying attention to what was going on. And so they are one of the first to bring in a bargain annex here in Washington, D.C. They're also one of the first to have a parking lot for people to come in the 1950s and such, to come in from these suburbs. One of my favorite things, though, with this little diagram, so 7th Street may be the main entrance, but it's not the original entrance. The original Hex was just this little tiny building here that when they expanded, they turned into the men's store with its own entrance, and basically there was no crossover between these. So this was all the woman's domain, and then, yeah, the guys can go here. The only part that was staffed by men, and the men have their own separate entrance. Now, this is the other reason why I really wanted to do the work on this tour. Today, Heck's flagship is not a department store. It is a mixed-use development project. And so the development that took it on took a look into the history of this department store. They didn't want to name it anything that you see a lot in DC, Freedom, Liberty, Eagle, things like that. No. And so this was a department store that was targeted by a civil rights activist. And so Mary Church Terrell, who is a fascinating woman, and she is going to be one of the first African-American women to graduate with a bachelor's from Oberlin. She's going to be one of the first African-American women to get a doctorate, and she does that over in England. And she is a massive, massive coordinator for the civil rights movement. And so she decided to organize what you're seeing in the next photo, a picket of Heck's department store. And she used to say that she could walk from the Capitol to the White House with coins jingling in her pocket and would not be able to find a single place to serve her coffee. Because either she couldn't go in because she's African American, or she couldn't go in because she's a woman. And so she led a protest to integrate Heck's department store's lunch counter successfully. And so when the development is looking into the history, they actually named the development, it's currently named Trail Place, after her. But I loved this kind of idea and the story, but also this idea that, you know, these department stores really are a way of saying that you have a place where you are welcome, where you are allowed to be, that you are part of society. They do that for women, and that power was what drew the civil rights movement here to do that also, and to make that stand and to make that assertion for African Americans and African American women. Now, Heck's, especially after Woody's gets that subway station, is suffering quite a bit. They actually built a second location. Now, this is also at Metro Center, and you can walk straight in. This is the only one that's still sort of operating as a department store. It was bought out by Macy's, and so it is a Macy's. Not the best Christmas windows, and they don't get like the good ones. But this is going to be the only place you can still go in as a department store. Like I said, you can still get in from the subway. Now we talk about Morton's. This photo is my white whale. I had to work so hard for this photo. And so Morton's department store is going to be this larger building right here. In the background, this is the National Archives. This building right here is actually Saks from Cannes that we saw way at the beginning, and then there's a bank right here. So Morton's, like Cannes, does things a little differently. Morton's is going to be run by a Jewish man, and he decides he doesn't really care that much about segregation or all of that brouhaha. So as far as he's concerned, African Americans are welcome to shop, welcome to buy, and they're welcome to use the dressing rooms. There were no department stores, even if they did allow African American patrons to purchase objects, things for sale. Many of them would not allow you to use the dressing room. And so Morton's is very different. In general, a lot of the lighter complected staff quits in protest and frustration due to prejudices of the day. And he actually kind of becomes the de facto department store for the African American community. Now, again, take a look at that side facade. I'm going to flip this really quick back here. And so now in the 1960s, DC, like many other cities, saw a lot of violence erupt after the assassination of Dr. King. This department store, like many others, suffered quite a bit of damage. Morton's takes a very interesting approach to it. It's very close to Easter. He knows he's got a ton of patrons that have been paying on layaway for Easter dresses and Easter goods and things like that. And so he says, you know what? If you've got your receipts proving that you've been making your payments, take them to any of my department stores in the city, and we'll honor it as long as we've got it in stock, or we'll find it in stock for you at another Morton's. And so a lot of his legacy is from an article in the paper from when the department store closed, or in his obituary. Now, we are starting to come up close to our time, but this is the busy corner. Oh no, I don't know. So as things go out into the suburbs, these flagships are struggling. They are old buildings. They are big buildings, and they are in the heart of downtown. But a lot of them are also nostalgia buildings. There's a lot of codes and restrictions about being able to change things. One of the things Cannes does is puts a very modern facade over their building, and that causes a problem when a fire erupts. Now, there's a little bit of a conspiracy theory here because they've been desperately trying to sell the building. Nobody wants the building. They just want the land underneath it. The city keeps telling them they can't tear it down because it's a historic building. And an electrical fire kind of just happens to spark right around the time that they lose their last court case on this. The firefighters were not able to get the fire hoses through the facade, and pretty much the entire thing burns out, allowing it to be torn down. Now, having said that, these old buildings are also a nightmare for electricity. I mean, a lot of them are built when Edison is basically starting to wire cities. And so this was the busy corner as it was back in the day. Again, this is late 1800s. This is old building. This is what happens with the fire. Now, of course, we're also seeing a different style. You don't have to tell me, but how many of you are at least ordering a few of the gifts online? I will admit, when I had family living all across the country, it was so much easier just to be like, no, just ship it to them. I'm going to pay $5 for gift wrapping and be done with it because I'm not seeing them. But one of the things that we are seeing is we are seeing a difference in the way people interact with retail. And I'm very curious how that may affect some of those numbers. Like I said, that 80% purchasing power associated with women, whether or not that changes things, how that affects things. So we are in a little bit of a state of flux with retail, but I think that it's really important to look at this idea of how things and objects in our culture can sometimes change society without necessarily an intentional attempt to change society, but just by creating this space that people deserve to be in anyway. And with that, I am going to go ahead and go to our final slide, another Elizabeth Barhawk Jones painting, and turn it back over to our host for some Q&A.
Megan, that was fantastic. I was sitting here completely wrapped. Just absolutely loved that conversation. And based on what was going on in the chat, it seems like the audience was also very, very excited. So again, I would encourage you, if you have any questions for Megan or Caitlin, you can put them in the Q&A, or if you can't find the Q&A, you can put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring that. And we'd love to answer your questions. But just to get us started, so Megan, you spoke about this kind of term of accidental feminism. And I was wondering if you could expand on that and talk a little bit more about how you see accidental feminism intersecting with the department stores that you talked about today.
Yeah, so like I said, a lot of it is just, they weren't trying, they were not these, they were not marching with the suffragists down Pennsylvania Avenue, like women right to vote, women are people too. No, they were like, oh, people give women money to buy things. We want them to buy things from us. Like, it was not like, some of them may have been feminist, some of them may not have been, but, that was not the point. The point was that they saw money on the table that was there for the taking, but it does help allow even people that weren't very much in favor of women's rights, the department store wasn't really seen as a controversial, it wasn't those crazy new women out there in out there in the department stores. It was just, oh no, this is a thing now for proper women, for behaving women even. And so it wasn't really seen as radical. And that, I think that's one of the reasons why it was actually in many ways so effective, is to shifting some of that societal discourse. I mean, if you can't even leave your house unescorted, how are people going to take your vote seriously? How are people going to take you asking for things seriously? And so, like I said, I think that idea, and I talk about it sometimes. I do a lot with Impressionism. Gilded Age is one of my favorites. And so there's an Impressionist artist, Edgar Degas, who says he is a misogynist, and yet he's the one that champions Mary Cassatt to come and join the Impressionists. He champions Suzanne Valadon, who had started out as an artist model, into becoming a professional artist and mentoring her. So, mind you, he also says he's not an Impressionist, so we don't really have to take him very seriously about what he says about himself anyway. But, so there are these things where it's like, just because they don't, philosophically or politically believe and agree, they can still actually help the cause, so to speak.
Thank you for that answer. So this idea that money can be a great motivator for change, that is certainly something that we see pop up in other instances. So we've got a few questions coming in the Q&A. So someone is asking about the role of dressing rooms over time. Specifically thinking of Loehmann's or stores with open/group dressing rooms. And how that kind of intersects with what you were talking about today.
Sure. So, I mean, again, I think one of the biggest things with dressing rooms was really the fight for access. Again, this idea that if you were there were individuals that would not want to wear something that someone of a different racial group had tried on. And this is why in a lot of these stores, African-American women were not allowed to try on things to see how they fit. Now, even today, when sizes have kind of sort of stabilized, we still have to, you don't know that something fits until you try it on and you see exactly where it nips and tucks and pulls and billows and things like that. And these are the early days. Before that, all clothes were custom made, normally by you or sometimes by a seamstress. And so, you're dealing with these machine-made clothing that are being done in these more or less standard sizes. But, today you can get two pairs of jeans from the same company and there'll be two different sizes, depending on whether the fabric was at the top of the pile of 30 or the bottom of the top pile of 30 when they cut it out. Maybe it wasn't quite that bad back then, but that's the same sort of principle. And so being able to access dressing rooms it's a massive privilege when it comes to buying. As far as group dressing rooms and things like that, I mean, I know I always like trying on things with my friends. Like that was, that's what we did. We went to the mall, we tried on things and, showed each other. especially with kids, if you're trying to try on kids' clothes and stuff. And so it definitely, I would say group dressing rooms, it's not something I see so much or I'm as familiar with, but it's definitely, shopping is normally a group activity. And so, and again, if you're not welcome or allowed in the dressing room space, that is very much of an exclusion. And it, especially in a capitalist culture that says your money isn't, it has no value here. And that's a massive thing to say in a capitalist society.
Thank you so much for that answer. So, kind of related, somebody else asked when you were talking about the privilege of being able to try something on, Megan. And I'm assuming that they mean in the early department stores, but were all the clothes ready made, or could you buy bolts of fabric and patterns at the department store?
You could absolutely buy bolts of fabric and patterns and ready-mades. So if you're going to Garfinkel's, you're not probably not buying as much ready-made. But Garfinkel's is going to be the one, and even a little bit today, at the very high-end stores, you can order something and then the seamstress is going to come out and do your measurements and, kind of do that. So Garfinkel's probably a little more the bolts of cloth, but again, you're probably not sewing it yourself. You're probably hiring somebody in-house, or they're going to send out to the designer for it. Anything down from that, though, Woodward and Lothrop and such, there's a very good chance you're buying factory made goods. Now, a lot of times it's going to be the basics. The shirtwaist is probably the most famous due to the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire in New York City. But what they were making is the white button-up shirts that would go underneath the skirt and over the chemise. Like if you think of like the Victorian school teacher, like she's always wearing that white shirt. That's a shirtwaist. And so, and at the time of the fire, I think there were a couple hundred shirtwaist factories in New York City. And so, yeah, you're getting these massive amounts of, factory made clothing. It is basic. It's not too fancy, but you could absolutely buy notions as well. That's going to be your buttons and your pins and your ribbons and your eyelet and your lace and all the things to gussy up that basic item that you have and make it just a little bit more.
Thank you. So we're almost at time here, so I want to end with two more questions. And one kind of relates to almost the tagline for our promotion around this tour today, which is the idea that women love to shop. And how that is a very simplistic statement that we need to complicate with this really fascinating history. So someone is wondering that women today have a reputation, unwarranted reputation, of being frivolous spenders. So do you have any background on when this stereotype started? And was it an attempt to mold behavior, particularly, Megan, as you were talking about with that early history where men, maybe they allowed their wives to have the purchasing power, but they were very, very aware of who was selling to them.
Yeah, so I think honestly, you actually see that pretty early on. This idea like, oh, yes, the wife's going shopping, like a little bit of it was just, things that women did were not taken very seriously. And this even extends to, I know Caitlin mentioned I do a First Ladies tour. The first role of the First Lady is to be in charge of the soft diplomacy, the party diplomacy, the making sure that people feel welcome and have good feelings, warm, fuzzy feelings, and want to do things for you. And that's an essential part of diplomacy, but it's not taken very seriously, like, oh, yes, they had a party. But they don't really talk about like, oh, who talked to who at the party and like what happened, or as much. It's in the gossip files as opposed to like the serious news stories. Like one of the ones I was reading just today is there's some back and forth about William and Kate and the Crown Princess of Sweden and whether or not they paid the appropriate attention to her during this fundraiser. And, but it's gossip rags that are commenting on this, not like serious politics, even though, if for some reason she would decide that, yes, they did treat me inappropriately and I don't like them anymore, it could, because she is the Crown Princess of Sweden and he's the Crown Prince of England. And so I think it was just that general kind of it also reminds me a lot. This is something that kind of comes up a little bit on the internet, but this idea that, when girls get really excited about concerts or things, like it's treated as silly and childish, but when guys get really excited about sports in much the same way, it's taken much more seriously. And so I think it's kind of a way of just dismissing, ignoring, and refuting that power and trying to keep women maybe even from realizing the power that they have and keep them from being able to really exercise it. Because again, that boycotts are absolutely a thing that, can affect companies, maybe not the biggest companies, or you have to get a pretty big boycott going, but there is something to be said with the power of money, where you spend it and how you spend it. And if women control 80% of the purchasing power, that's a massive amount of power there.
Yeah, I'm so in agreement with that answer because a lot of the times we'll talk about other historical eras where the power of the purse, women's control of
Mhm.
the purse, was so incredibly important for making political statements, such as during the American Revolution, purchasing colony-made goods as opposed to British-made goods, or during the abolitionist movement, purchasing free-made goods as opposed to slave-made goods. So the power of the purse is essential across time. So as a final, oh, sorry,
I
Megan.
was going to say, I do want to just say there's somebody was asking about why Morton's was my white whale. I could not for the life of me find the exact address until I found that photo in the Library of Congress. It was just like, Caitlin can tell you, it took me like a year after I started doing this tour. I was like, it was somewhere in this intersection. And I think that that's possibly because it was an African-American targeted department store. It didn't get the same number of photos and things like that. So sorry, go ahead.
No, please. I was going to ask that question. So just as a kind of final wrap up question. So when I first heard about this tour, I also thought department stores and women's history. I thought of department stores as just these innocuous spaces where I go, I spend more money than I mean to, and then I leave and I don't think about it. So,
So did
power of
Caitlin,
the
actually,
purse.
but she was like, I'll let you run with it.
So I guess the question that I have to kind of wrap us up today and this can be for Caitlin and Megan, are there any other spaces and places that you think about, particularly as tour guides, that you think are essential for understanding women's history?
So I think that that's a hard question because again, I like the ones that do bubble underneath the surface. I would actually say the society pages is one because again, people don't really take that history very seriously. Somebody in the chat is throwing out beauty parlors. A more modern one I actually want to talk, I would actually say is street art. That is a place where we see a lot of artists that are kind of feel shut out, whether they are or not, by the modern art culture that still is extremely pasty, pale, and male. So you see a lot of women that are doing, street art, a lot of minorities that are doing street art and things like that. And so a lot of times it's things that are just around the corner, or like I said, things that are bubbling right there. And it's really all about, kind of just looking a little harder. And that's why I have that pre-World War II. I saw somebody in the chat was like, World War II did change a lot for women in employment, but there was a lot more women employed before World War II than we often think about, between teachers and nurses and lawyers and judges and doctors. And there's actually a lot of them before World War II, even though we don't really think of it as happening until then. And so that's actually one of the things that I love about women's history is, 50% of the population, a little bit more when there's world wars going on. You don't really have to dig too deep or scratch too hard to start finding these stories.
Well, I think that is a wonderful place to end today's program on this, that you can find women's history just around the next corner. You can always look for it. So Megan, Caitlin, thank you so much for bringing us these wonderful stories today and these wonderful images. I know I learned a lot. And this has been such a joy to have you all with us today. And maybe as our audience goes out and does that holiday shopping, they'll think a little bit differently about the stores that they walk into and the power of their purse. So again, we encourage you to check out a tour of Her Own and their website. They've got fabulous tours, and also our website, womenshistory.org, for related materials and some tours that we're doing in partnership with Toho. So again, Megan, Caitlin, thank you so much. Thank you to our audience, and have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thank you all so much.
Bye, y'all.